Music legend Sir Cliff Richard is coming back to Australian shores.
For decades, Cliff Richard was seen as the clean, smiling face of British pop, a superstar who seemed untouched by scandal. Then suddenly, the spotlight that once celebrated him turned harsh and unforgiving. At 85, Cliff has finally opened up about why he slowly stepped away from fame. And it wasn't because the applause faded. It was because allegations and aggressive media coverage changed everything overnight. One moment, he was a national treasure. The next, his name was being dragged through headlines that questioned his character and his life's work. In this video, we'll uncover how false accusations, public judgment, and nonstop media pressure shattered his sense of safety, reshaped his public image, and pushed him to choose peace over the spotlight. Cliff Richard entered the world as Harry Roger Webb, born in Lucknow during the final fading chapter of British India. His earliest memories were gentle ones, sun-soaked days, and a sense of safety that felt permanent. But history had other plans. As political tension rose and independence loomed, his family was forced to leave everything behind. Boarding an overcrowded ship bound for England, what awaited them was not opportunity, but a nation still bruised by war. Post-war Britain was cold, rationed, and unforgiving. In a modest Hertfordshire home, young Harry felt the shock of loss keenly. The warmth of his childhood replaced by scarcity and uncertainty. That emotional rupture planted something restless in him, a need to rise above circumstances that had stripped his family of comfort and certainty. Music became his refuge. When American rock and roll reached his ears, the swagger of Elvis, the fire of Little Richard, it felt like a lifeline. These sounds didn't ask him to belong, they dared him to stand out. By his late teens, Harry Webb shed his past and stepped forward as Cliff Richard, a name built for strength and endurance. Backed by a group that would become the Shadows, he recorded Move It, a song that sliced through Britain's polite pop scene with raw defiance. The response was explosive. Fans screamed, fainted, and worshipped him in ways previously reserved for American stars. Almost overnight, Cliff Richard became more than a singer. He became a symbol, a voice for change. The moment Britain found its own rock and roll rebel. The 1960s rewarded rebellion. Pop stars were expected to flirt with danger, burn brightly, and live recklessly. Cliff Richard was meant to follow that script until he shattered it. At the very peak of his fame, before a vast crowd gathered by American evangelist Billy Graham, Cliff made a choice that stunned his fans and unsettled the industry. He publicly declared his Christian faith. It wasn't private or cautious. It was bold, unmistakable, and broadcast for the nation to witness. For many, it felt like betrayal. Britain's answer to Elvis suddenly seemed to be stepping away from the image that had made him untouchable. Behind the scenes, panic spread. Managers and executives quietly predicted the end. Some even imagined Cliff abandoning music altogether for a quiet, ordinary life. Cliff himself feared the same. He wrestled with the belief that faith and fame could not coexist, that one life would have to be surrendered for the other. Yet he did something few expected. He stayed. He refused to choose. Instead, he forged a path no major British pop star had walked before, living openly by his beliefs while remaining fully committed to his career. That decision didn't just preserve his place in music, it reshaped him. Years later, Cliff admitted that much of his early bravado had been a performance, a shield for deep self-doubt. Faith stripped that mask away. With it came a quieter confidence, a sense of peace that freed him from constantly pretending to be someone else. But this inner stability was forged through loss. At just 21, Cliff lost his father suddenly, becoming the family's emotional and financial anchor overnight. Decades later, he endured the slow heartbreak of watching his mother fade into Alzheimer's, a vigil that left lasting scars. Duty became central to his life, often at the expense of personal joy. Love slipped through his fingers. A relationship with a dancer he deeply cared for ended in a painful letter, where he admitted he could not balance marriage with his responsibilities. Other romances came and went, undone by fame, pressure, and the weight he carried. Still, Cliff endured. While new bands conquered the world, he survived by standing still in his truth. No longer just a pop idol, Cliff Richard became something rarer, a man shaped as much by faith, sacrifice, and resilience as by the music that made him famous. Among the many brief romances in Cliff Richard's life, one story lingered longer than all the others, a love that never fully surfaced, yet never truly faded. In the early 1970s, Cliff welcomed a young Australian singer, Olivia Newton-John, onto his television show. From their first performance together, something unmistakable filled the space between them. Their voices locked effortlessly, their ease undeniable. What began as a friendship slowly deepened for Cliff into something far more personal. But Olivia's heart was already entangled elsewhere. She was involved with Bruce Welch, Cliff's closest friend and bandmate from the Shadows. Their relationship was troubled from the start, shadowed by secrecy and the fact that Bruce was still married when it began. For 5 long years, they remained engaged, circling a future that never arrived. When Olivia finally walked away, Bruce collapsed inward, sinking into depression and episodes of self-harm, unable to cope with the loss. Throughout it all, Cliff said nothing. He stood suspended between loyalty and longing, choosing silence over confession. Years later, Cliff finally put words to what he had carried quietly for decades. He admitted he had loved Olivia, but realized it was too late. Interfering would have meant betraying a friend, and that was a line he refused to cross, even at the cost of his own happiness. It was a sacrifice that left a mark no time could erase. Yet their bond never broke. Cliff and Olivia continued to share music for over 40 years, recording unforgettable duets like Suddenly for Xanadu and performing together on stages around the world. Cliff often spoke of her rare grace, a warmth he felt no one else possessed. Their final performance together came during his 75th birthday concerts at the Royal Albert Hall, when they sang Suddenly one last time. Neither knew it was goodbye. Weeks before Olivia passed away in 2022, Cliff called her. She sounded bright, her familiar warmth masking the pain of her long illness. He later wrote that he never imagined it would be their final conversation. When she was gone, Cliff avoided the word death. He said she had simply stopped living, the only phrase that matched the silence she left behind. This unfulfilled love became one of the quiet tragedies of his life. While Cliff filled arenas with sound, his private world held a longing no applause could ever heal. By the middle of the 1970s, Cliff Richard faced something he had never truly known before: silence. For the first time since his rise to fame, an entire year passed without a single charting song. To the outside world, it looked like the end of the road. Music had changed, youth ruled the charts, and Cliff, once seen as Britain's original rock rebel, now seemed like a relic of another era. Critics quietly prepared his farewell. Then, just as expectations sank, Cliff defied them. In 1976, he returned with Devil Woman, a song steeped in shadow and mystery, far removed from the clean-cut image that had followed him for years. It was dark, sharp, and unexpected, and it worked. The track surged into the top 10 on both sides of the Atlantic, selling millions and forcing a complete reassessment of who Cliff Richard really was. Almost overnight, he was no longer dismissed as yesterday's star. A new audience listened, even rock royalty took notice, with figures like Jimmy Page, Eric Clapton, and Elton John openly backing his comeback. One critic went so far as to compare the album's depth to soul legends of the era. This wasn't a comeback single, it was a reinvention. What followed was a decade defined by adaptation rather than nostalgia. Cliff proved he could evolve without chasing trends. Albums like Always Guaranteed balanced contemporary sound with emotional maturity, going platinum and producing multiple hits. Then came Christmas 1988. Mistletoe and Wine, intended as a modest seasonal release, became a cultural moment, soaring to number 1, dominating the charts for weeks, and becoming the year's best-selling single. It would return every holiday season, quietly cementing his enduring reach. By 1989, Cliff's confidence had come full circle. Celebrating his 100th single, he invited fans to the London Palladium and let them decide his next release, a rare gesture that deepened his bond with the public and delivered yet another hit. That same year, he filled Wembley Stadium with the event, a concert honoring both his 1950s beginnings and his modern resurgence. Filmed and shared worldwide, it stood as proof that he wasn't merely holding on, he was flourishing. By decade's end, Cliff had achieved something unprecedented: #1 singles across 5 consecutive decades. What once appeared to be a quiet collapse in the mid-70s had transformed into one of the most extraordinary reinventions in British music history. A reminder that endurance, when paired with courage, can outlast time itself. By the closing years of the 1990s, Cliff Richard had nothing left to prove. Yet the industry that once relied on him seemed eager to move on without him. When he released the Millennium Prayer, a quiet but striking reworking of the Lord's Prayer set to the familiar melody of Auld Lang Syne, the response from the radio was cold, even dismissive. Major broadcasters refused to play it, arguing it held no appeal for younger listeners. Some DJs went further, openly ridiculing the idea and branding Cliff as out of step with modern music. It stung, especially as artists of his generation were still being welcomed on the airwaves. For many performers, that kind of rejection would have ended the story. But Cliff's story had never followed the usual rules. Without radio support, without heavy promotion, and with little help from the industry machine, his audience stepped in. Fans bought the single in huge numbers, passed it from hand to hand, and turned what was meant to be ignored into something impossible to overlook. Against all expectations, the song rose straight to #1 and stayed there for weeks. It became his 14th UK chart topper, arriving 4 decades after his first, and carried its quiet defiance far beyond Britain, climbing charts in Australia, New Zealand, and across Europe. The achievement meant more than sales. It felt like a collective statement, a reminder that listeners, not gatekeepers, still held the final say. By then, Cliff's legacy was already extraordinary. Hundreds of millions of records sold, a knighthood, national honors, and decades of charitable work had cemented his place in British life. He had spoken openly about faith, given generously to children's causes, and remained a familiar presence across generations. Yet, the hurt of being sidelined by the very industry he helped shape lingered. The Millennium Prayer became his answer to that rejection, not loud, not angry, but quietly powerful. A final proof that resilience, when backed by belief and but loyalty, could still rise above doubt and be heard. By 2014, Cliff Richard had endured enough storms to believe little could still surprise him. Then, from his home in Portugal, he turned on the television and watched his world collapse in real time. There were helicopters above his house in Berkshire. Police officers are moving through his private rooms, cameras everywhere. What looked at first like a crime scene soon revealed something far worse. It was his life being dismantled on live television. South Yorkshire police had ordered the search, and the BBC, alerted in advance, broadcasted as breaking news. For Cliff, it felt less like justice and more like a public execution. The allegation behind it was deeply disturbing, a claim that he had assaulted a man decades earlier at a Billy Graham event in the 1980s. Yet as facts surfaced, the accusation began to unravel. The accuser described a room that did not exist at the venue at the time. Security officers who could have confirmed Cliff was never alone were never questioned. Still, the investigation dragged on for nearly 2 years, consuming vast public funds while Cliff's name was splashed across headlines worldwide without a shred of evidence. The personal toll was immense. Once a performer who commanded stadiums, Cliff withdrew from public life. He barely left his home. His health suffered weight loss, shingles, and sleepless nights. He spoke of feeling that his house itself had been violated, no longer a place of safety. Albums, books, appearances, all quietly abandoned. The cruelty deepened when the BBC submitted its raid footage for journalism awards, while the case was still unresolved, turning his anguish into spectacle. When prosecutors finally confirmed no charges would be brought, Cliff felt no relief. The phrasing, insufficient evidence, felt like another wound. He wanted clarity, not ambiguity. In 2018, justice arrived from a different direction. The High Court ruled that his privacy had been unlawfully breached and that the coverage was sensational and wrong. Damages were awarded, and the decision reshaped how the British media handles unproven accusations. Yet nothing could erase the damage. Cliff later said he felt betrayed, not just investigated, but smeared. even cleared, he feared suspicion would linger. A reputation built over 6 decades had been reduced in the public imagination to a raid and a rumor. It was the darkest chapter of his life. Cliff Richard's story remains one of towering success and devastating trial. A man who gave everything to music, only to discover how fragile honor can be when institutions forget compassion.